Hey Northwood, I hope you're doing well and thank you for joining me on the latest installment of Ask Mitch. As always, you can email me your questions at mitch@northwoodcc.org. Please keep your questions to 100 words or less so I can do my best to answer them succinctly. Today's question is this: Are we experiencing the times of tribulation? We can very easily see with everything going on in our world today where this question comes from. And various passages like Matthew 13, Matthew 24, John 16, Romans 12, Revelation 1, Revelation 7 mention the tribulations that we should expect in this world. And two passages specifically, Matthew 24 and Revelation 7, mention something called the Great Tribulation. Now, there are various views on how to understand this and how the scriptures apply to our world today related to this topic. But for the sake of time today, I'm only going to give my perspective and my understanding of scripture on this topic. I'm not going to have the time to represent every perspective. So if what I say doesn't quite line up with how you understand the scriptures or your own theological convictions, I understand that. I'm just not taking the time to explain every view. But as I see it, the Bible as a pattern expects that the church and individual Christians will experience tribulation. This is the most common way the word tribulation is used in Scripture. It's something that the authors talking about tribulation expect Christians will experience. Now, Matthew 24 and Revelation 7, as I've already mentioned, describe something called the Great Tribulation. And many have come to associate that with the end or the last days and the appearance of an antichrist. But as Rory pointed out a few weeks ago in our sermon series on 1 Timothy, when the scriptures speak of the last days, it's speaking of the entire period between Jesus' ascent into heaven and the time when Jesus finally comes back to establish his kingdom when he returns in glory. Further, 1 John and 2 John tell us that we are in the last hour right now, and they make it plain that there are many antichrists. For the antichrist is anyone who does not confess that Jesus has come in the flesh. The antichrists are many because there are many who oppose Jesus and his kingdom. So as a pattern of reading scripture, I don't think the book of Revelation or other prophecies about the last times are intended to be mapped in detail onto the events of human history. In other words, I think we miss the point of Revelation and these other prophecies when we try to figure out who the Antichrist is, or how a specific war or how other events in our history fit into the timeline and events we see in Scripture. Instead, I think it's more helpful to allow what Jesus tells us his purpose is for telling us these signs and allow his purpose to guide our approach. And we see that purpose stated in Matthew 24. In Matthew 24, he describes the period leading up to this tribulation as a time when Christians are hated by the nations, when many Christians will fall away, when lawlessness increases, when nations will rise against nations, and we'll hear of wars and rumors of wars, and we'll see famines and earthquakes. And while we are seeing many of those things today, all of these things are the kinds of things we've seen throughout human history. But in that description, Jesus mentions specifically three things, three purposes for why he's telling us. He tells us this so that first we will not be led astray. Apparently many in Jesus' day and the days after were misled to think Jesus had already returned, or they had missed out, or they didn't really understand the gospel. And so false teachers came in using eschatology, the study of the end times, the last things, to lead people away from Jesus. So Jesus is telling us these signs so that we will not be led astray. The second reason he tells them is so that we would not be alarmed. As we see all these signs and see things like a global pandemic and wars and economies crashing, it's easy for people of all types to become alarmed and fearful. But Jesus tells us this is what we should expect so that we wouldn't become alarmed, so that we wouldn't be fearful. But finally, he tells us these things so that we would endure. Knowing what is to come, when tribulation, sufferings, and all these things happen, Jesus is telling us what to expect so that we would be faithful all the way until the end when he finally comes back. So my answer to this question, are we experiencing the times of tribulation? Well, on the one hand, yes, we are experiencing the times of tribulation right now as this pandemic unfolds and we see other crazy events in human history. But on the other hand, what we are experiencing is not any different than what other Christians have experienced at so many other points in human history, such as the Black Plague or the Crusades or even the World Wars. All these things fit onto the pattern of what Jesus told us to expect. And so with all that, I'd encourage all of us to do exactly what Jesus urges us to do with this information, to not allow ourselves to be led astray, to not grow in fear, but instead to focus on enduring to the end by faithfully following Jesus through every trial and every tribulation. Thanks for tuning in. Look forward to talking with you next time.